Picture this: a roaring crowd, the thunder of hooves, and the flash of polished armor under the sun. But this isn't just a battlefield. It's the stage where medieval knights became legends. Long before sports stars or Hollywood actors, these men were the original celebrities, their names chanted by thousands, their victories etched into history. Yet what we think we know about knights, the jousts, the chivalry, the noble ideals is only the surface. Behind the spectacle of the tournament arena lay a world far more complex, a world where skill and showmanship were as vital as swordplay, where politics and personal ambition danced alongside honor. Tournaments weren't just games, they were high-stakes theaters of power, where a knight's reputation could make or break his fortune. Imagine the pressure: one misstep, and a lifetime of training could unravel before the eyes of kings and rivals. But it wasn't just about winning. These events were woven into the fabric of society, shaping alliances, settling grudges, even deciding marriages. The knights who excelled here weren't just fighters. They were diplomats, performers, and sometimes cunning strategists playing a dangerous game far beyond the tiltyard. So what did it really take to become one of these elite warriors? How did they train, live, and navigate the cutthroat world of medieval fame? From the grueling drills that began at dawn to the secret codes of conduct that governed their lives, this is the untold story of tournament knights. It's a tale of ambition, artistry, and survival in an era where glory was fleeting and the stakes were life or death. By the end of this journey, you'll see these knights not as distant figures from storybooks, but as real men who shaped history, one thrilling tournament at a time. The earliest tournaments were far from the choreographed displays of later centuries. They were raw, dangerous, and barely distinguishable from actual warfare. Picture hundreds of armored knights charging across open fields, swinging blunted swords with enough force to shatter bones, while nobles watched from makeshift pavilions. These mock battles, known as melees, were less about pageantry and more about survival. A knight could be captured, ransomed, or even killed in the chaos, making every tournament a gamble with fate. Yet this brutality served a purpose. It hardened warriors for the relentless violence of medieval combat, where skill alone wasn't enough. You needed endurance, cunning, and the ability to think amid chaos. By the 11th century, these war games had spread across Europe, but it was in France where they truly took root. The very first recorded tournament was held in the year 1066, the same fateful year as the Norman conquest of England. Coincidence? Hardly. Knights who trained in these early tournaments went on to fight in real battles, their reputations forged in both arenas. But as the 12th century dawned, something shifted. Nobles began to see tournaments as more than just training grounds. They were stages for political theater. A skilled knight could win not just glory, but land, titles, and the favor of kings. Suddenly, the wild melee started gaining rules, referees, and even designated safe zones to protect the most valuable contestants. What caused this transformation? Look to the rise of chivalry, a code that turned knights into more than just warriors. As ideals of honor and courtly love spread, tournaments became a way to prove worth beyond brute strength. Jousting, once just one small part of the melee, grew into the main event where a single knight could shine in front of roaring crowds. The armor grew more ornate, the ceremonies more elaborate, and the prizes more extravagant. By the 1300s, a tournament wasn't complete without feasts, minstrels, and nobles placing bets on their champions. What began as a survival drill had become the medieval equivalent of a superstar athlete's arena where reputation, romance, and raw skill collided under the watchful eyes of history. To stand in the arena as a tournament knight meant mastering more than just the sword. It demanded the cunning of a merchant, the charm of a courtier, and the endurance of a soldier. Take William Marshall, the son of a minor noble who rose from obscurity to become one of England's most celebrated knights. His secret: he treated tournaments like a business. At a time when a single victory could earn a knight enough ransom money to live comfortably for months, Marshall and others like him traveled from event to event, not just for glory but for profit. They studied opponents, forged alliances, and even negotiated ransoms on the spot, turning combat into a calculated trade. But the life of a tournament knight wasn't just about wealth, it was survival in a world where reputation was currency. A single defeat could tarnish a career, while a string of victories might catch the eye of a king. Knights like Ulrich von Littenstein, a German nobleman who famously jousted in disguise to prove his devotion to a lady, understood the power of spectacle. They wore elaborate armor, adopted symbolic colors, and even staged dramatic entrances to captivate crowds. These weren't just battles, they were performances where every move was choreographed to build a legend. Behind the pageantry, though, lay grueling sacrifice. Training began at dawn, with hours spent mastering the lance, sword, and horsemanship. A knight's body bore the scars of his craft: broken bones, torn muscles, and the ever-present risk of fatal accidents. And the costs were staggering. Custom armor alone could bankrupt a lesser noble, while horses bred for tournaments were as valuable as castles. Many knights relied on patrons or borrowed heavily, gambling their futures on the next tournament's prize. Yet the greatest challenge wasn't physical, it was political. Tournaments were battlegrounds of influence, where a well-timed victory could secure a royal appointment or a lucrative marriage. Knights navigated webs of alliances, knowing that offending the wrong noble might mean exile from the circuit. Even the rules were fluid, often bent to favor local champions or settle old grudges. To succeed, a knight needed the instincts of a diplomat as much as the reflexes of a warrior. In the end, the tournament knight was a paradox: a warrior poet, a mercenary idealist, a man who lived by the sword but thrived by his wits. Their legacy isn't just in the trophies they won, but in the way they shaped the very idea of knighthood, blending combat with artistry to create a spectacle that still captivates us today. The path to becoming a tournament knight began not on the battlefield, but in the quiet corners of a noble's castle, where boys as young as 7 were sent away to begin their apprenticeship. These pages didn't just serve meals or run errands, they were immersed in a world where every chore doubled as a lesson. Carrying a heavy tray taught balance, fetching armor built familiarity with its weight and fit. But the real training came in the yards, where they spent endless hours mastering the fundamentals. Horsemanship wasn't just about riding, it was about becoming one with the animal, learning to anticipate its movements while clad in 50 pounds of steel. A single misstep could spell disaster in the lists, so they practiced mounting and dismounting in full gear until it felt as natural as breathing. By their early teens, those who showed promise were promoted to squires, stepping into the shadow of experienced knights. This was where theory met reality. Squires didn't just clean armor, they studied its construction, learning where to strike and how to deflect blows. They trained with blunted swords, their arms aching from repetitive drills designed to make each parry instinctive. But the lance was the ultimate test. On wooden horses called quintains, they charged at spinning targets, knowing that a poorly aimed strike would send the dummy's weighted arms swinging back to knock them senseless. The message was clear: precision mattered more than power. Yet the most critical lessons weren't taught with weapons. Squires observed their masters like apprentices in a cutthroat trade, noting how seasoned knights read crowds, negotiated ransoms, or turned defeats into moral victories. They learned to spot subtle tells in opponents: a horse's flicking ear signaling distraction, a shield held just slightly too low, revealing a weakness. Tournament veterans knew that psychological edges often decided matches before lances even shattered. A well-timed taunt, a flashy maneuver to please spectators, or the strategic choice to yield at the right moment could elevate a knight's reputation far beyond a simple win-loss record. The final layer of training was the most dangerous, the secret mock tournaments held in remote fields, where young knights tested their skills without the safety of rules. These unofficial bouts were closer to the melees of old, with broken bones and concussions common, but they revealed who had the grit to endure real combat. By the time a squire earned his spurs, he wasn't just a fighter, he was a performer, a tactician, and a survivor. The arena might showcase his speed and strength, but the years of unseen discipline were what truly set him apart from the warriors who never left the battlefield. Behind the clashing swords and roaring crowds, tournaments ran on something far less romantic: cold, hard cash. A knight's glittering armor alone could cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings, crafted by master smiths, fitted with intricate designs and requiring constant upkeep. Then came the horses, not just any steeds, but towering destriers bred for strength and agility, each worth as much as a small estate. Add to that the cost of squires, grooms, physicians, and even heralds to announce a knight's arrival, and it's clear why only the wealthiest or the most desperate could afford this life. But where did the money come from? For every noble-born knight with family lands to fund his ambitions, there were a dozen others scrambling for sponsors. Wealthy patrons, dukes, bishops, even kings, would back promising fighters, covering their expenses in exchange for a share of the winnings and, more importantly, the reflected glory. A patron's colors displayed on a victorious knight's shield were like medieval branding, advertising their power and prestige. The most successful knights became walking advertisements, their triumphs boosting their backers' status across Europe. Yet the real moneymaker was far grittier: the ransom system. When a knight was unhorsed or yielded, his opponent could demand payment for his release, sometimes a hefty sum equivalent to years of income. This turned every match into a potential payday, with savvy knights targeting wealthy opponents like bankers hunting investments. William Marshall, the legendary 12th century knight, once captured 10 opponents in a single tournament, earning enough to live like a prince. But the practice had a dark side. Lesser knights, unable to pay, might forfeit their armor or horses, ending their careers on the spot. Some resorted to borrowing from loan sharks, plunging into debts they'd never escape. Then there were the prizes themselves: gold cups, jeweled weapons, even parcels of land dangled like carrots to lure the best competitors. But winning wasn't guaranteed, and the financial strain drove many to desperate measures. Some knights became mercenaries between tournaments, hiring out their swords to the highest bidder. Others played politics, trading victories for favors, throwing a match to appease a powerful noble, or securing a royal appointment in exchange for loyalty. The most cunning turned tournaments into full-time careers, traveling circuits like modern athletes. They studied event schedules, calculated risks, and even formed teams to dominate melees, splitting ransoms like business partners. But one bad fall, one unlucky strike, and it could all vanish. The line between fame and ruin was razor thin, and every time a knight rode into the arena, he wasn't just betting on his skill, he was gambling his future. In this world, chivalry wasn't just a code of honor. It was a survival strategy, a way to turn brute strength into something banks and kings would back. The tournament wasn't merely a sport. It was a high-stakes economy where every clash of steel rang with the sound of coins changing hands. Steel wasn't just protection, it was propaganda. A tournament knight's armor gleamed under the sun like a walking masterpiece, every curve and engrave shouting his status to the crowd. but beneath the gilded surfaces and fluted designs lay a brutal practicality. Battlefield armor prioritized mobility, allowing knights to swing swords and mount horses quickly. Tournament gear, though, was a different beast. Thicker plates, extra padding around the joints, and helmets with narrowed visors, all engineered to absorb the punishing blows of lances or maces in the lists. The trade-off, a suit could weigh over 90 pounds, turning each match into a test of endurance as much as skill. Lances tell their own story of calculated risk. While battlefield versions were sharpened to pierce armor, tournament lances were coronals, tipped with three-pronged heads to distribute impact. In theory, this reduced fatalities. In practice, a charging knight's momentum could still drive the blunt force through a visor or snap ribs like twigs. Some knights preferred lighter lances for speed, while others opted for thicker shafts that packed devastating power, even if it meant sacrificing precision. The choice wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. A heavier lance might intimidate opponents, while a quicker one allowed for last-second adjustments to strike an enemy's weakest point. Innovation thrived in these high-stakes laboratories of combat. Take the frog-mouth helm, a grotesque but brilliant design that angled the visor downward to deflect lance tips upward away from the wearer's face. Or the Grand Guard, a detachable steel plate that shielded the left shoulder and chest, the primary target in jousting. Saddles transformed too, with high cantles and pommels locking riders in place during collisions. Yet every advancement sparked debate. Traditionalists sneered at newfangled gadgets, arguing they undermined the purity of skill. When one German knight introduced a hinged lance rest that absorbed shock, rivals accused him of cheating until he kept winning. The most revealing details, though, were the hidden ones. X-rays of surviving armor show patches where metal was thinned discreetly to save weight, or layered strategically to reinforce against common strike angles. Some helmets bear grooves inside the visor, not from battle, but from a knight's nervous habit of grinding his teeth during charges. Even the flamboyant crests atop helmets served a purpose. Their bright colors and swirling shapes helped judges identify fallen riders in the dust-choked chaos of melees. What emerges isn't just a collection of weapons, but a portrait of ingenuity under pressure. Each modification, each gamble on new technology, reflects a world where knights were both athletes and engineers, constantly pushing the limits of their craft. The arena was their testing ground, and every dent in their armor tells a story of near misses, hard-won lessons, and the relentless pursuit of an edge in a game where the stakes were life, legacy, and sometimes redemption. The joust wasn't just the highlight of the tournament, it was the ultimate test of a knight's soul. Imagine the moment, two armored figures charging at each other at full gallop, lances leveled, the crowd's roar fading into a heartbeat silence. In that split second, everything hung in the balance, not just victory, but legacy. A single perfectly placed strike could splinter a lance against an opponent's shield, sending wood shards flying like fireworks, and the crowd would erupt. But miss by an inch, and the lance might glance harmlessly away, or worse, snap back with enough force to wrench a shoulder from its socket. This wasn't just sport, it was high-speed chess played with flesh and steel. Precision was everything. Knights trained for years to hit a target the size of a dinner plate at full speed, their bodies memorizing the exact angle to hold the lance, the precise moment to brace for impact. The best didn't just aim for the shield, they targeted specific painted emblems or weak points in the armor, exploiting microscopic flaws and horsemanship. That was half the battle. A destrier that flinched or veered could ruin everything, so knights bonded with their mounts like partners, whispering commands through the clangor of the arena. The greatest jousters weren't just strong, they were artists, their movements a dance of physics and instinct. but the risks were real. Even with blunted lances, the force of a collision could punch through armor like a hammer. Concussions were so common they were shrugged off as part of the job. Broken ribs, dislocated joints, and shattered fingers were badges of honor. And then there were the tragedies like the death of King Henry II of France, who took a splintered lance through the visor in 1559. Yet knights kept competing because the rewards outweighed the dangers. A single victorious pass could elevate a man from obscurity to legend, his name chanted in taverns and courts across Europe. Why such obsession with this one event? Because the joust distilled knighthood into its purest form. On the battlefield, chaos-ruled allies could steal your glory, or a lucky peasant's arrow could end your story. But in the lists, it was just you, your opponent, and the unforgiving truth of skill. No excuses, no distractions. Win here, and kings would court you. Chroniclers would immortalize you, and ladies would weave your colors into their sleeves. Lose, and you'd slink away to the sound of muffled laughter. That pressure forged knights who weren't just warriors, but icons, men who understood that sometimes reputation was the only armor that never rusted. The melee was where tournament knights proved their true mettle, not in the controlled clash of the joust, but in the swirling, dust-choked chaos of dozens of armored men fighting at once. Picture this, a field crammed with combatants, their blunted swords and maces still capable of crushing bones through armor, the air thick with shouts, the metallic tang of blood, and the panicked whinnies of horses. There were no neat lines or orderly passes here, just a brutal free-for-all where the rules were written in the moment. Knights formed fleeting alliances, only to betray them when opportunity struck. A lone fighter might be swarmed by rivals, while crafty veterans lurked at the edges, conserving strength to pick off the exhausted. This wasn't just a test of skill, it was a raw display of battlefield instincts, where the ability to read a shifting tide of combat meant survival. What made the melee so electrifying was its unpredictability. Unlike the joust's one-on-one duels, victory here demanded more than strength, it required the cunning of a fox. Some knights specialized in capture and ransom, targeting high-value opponents like nobles while avoiding dangerous brawlers. Others fought in tight teams, using coordinated strikes to isolate enemies. The smartest played psychological games, feigning injury to lure opponents into traps or using the crowd's noise to mask their movements. Every melee was a living chessboard with pieces that could suddenly change sides. But as tournaments evolved, the melee's wild energy became a liability. By the 1400s, kings and nobles favored the joust spectacle, its clear rules, dramatic clashes, and easier-to-judge outcomes. The melee, with its messy brawls and shadowy tactics, seemed outdated beside the joust's chivalric theater. Critics called it a brawl of butchers, unbecoming of refined knights. Yet something deeper was at work. The melee's decline mirrored a cultural shift. Knighthood was no longer just about battlefield prowess. It was becoming a performance of ideals of courtesy, restraint, and individual glory. The joust, with its solitary champions and scripted drama, fit this new narrative perfectly. Still, the melee left an indelible mark. Its spirit lived on in the knights who'd survived its crucible, men who understood that real combat was never as clean as the lists. And in rare corners of Europe, particularly Germany and the Low Countries, local tournaments kept the tradition alive well into the Renaissance. There, away from royal courts, knights still clashed in the old way, where victory went not to the strongest but to the most adaptable. The melee's lesson was simple. In war and in life, rules are fleeting, but the ability to think on your feet, that's timeless. Women were the silent architects of the tournament world, their influence woven into every glittering spectacle. While knights basked in the spotlight, noblewomen shaped the arena from the shadows not just as spectators, but as power brokers. A single silk scarf tied to a knight's lance could alter his fate, signaling a lady's favor and electrifying the crowd. These tokens weren't mere romantic gestures, they were political statements. When a queen like Elena of Aquitaine awarded her colors to a competitor, she wasn't just cheering, she was endorsing his cause, signaling alliances to every noble watching. Some women went further, bending the rigid rules of chivalry to their will. Take Joan of Arc, who famously donned armor and rode into tournaments, her presence alone challenging the notion that combat was solely a man's domain. Then there were figures like Nicola de la Haye, who defended castles in her husband's absence, proving that martial skill wasn't bound by gender. Even when barred from the lists, noblewomen mastered the art of influence. They negotiated ransoms, settled disputes between rival knights, and sometimes funded entire tournaments, turning the events into extensions of their own ambitions. Behind the scenes, their labor kept the tournament machine running. While knights trained, women managed sprawling estates, balancing ledgers, overseeing harvests, and ensuring coffers were full enough to fund the next campaign for glory. A knight's reputation might rest on his lance arm, but his ability to compete often depended on his wife's financial savvy. Records from medieval England show noblewomen like Margaret Beaufort personally auditing accounts, selling wool to pay for armor, or mortgaging lands to cover tournament debts. Their work was invisible to cheering crowds, but without it, the golden age of chivalry would have collapsed under its own extravagance. The most striking legacy of these women, though, was how they reshaped chivalry itself. Queens like Elena didn't just watch tournaments, they curated them, infusing the violence with poetry, music, and ideals of courtly love. Under their influence, brute strength gave way to artistry. Knights began competing as much for poetic praise as for victory. The tournament became a stage where women's preferences dictated the rules, where a well-crafted sonnet could earn as much applause as a shattered lance. In this way, the women who seemed excluded from the arena actually defined its soul, proving that power wasn't always won with a sword. Sometimes it was woven into the very fabric of the spectacle, one silk favor at a time. Tournaments were the chessboards of medieval power plays, where every shattered lance and fallen knight sent ripples through the courts of Europe. Take King Edward I of England, who didn't just host tournaments, he weaponized them. After crushing Welsh rebellions, he staged lavish events near conquered territories, parading captured Welsh nobles as spectators while his knights jousted in triumph. The message was unmistakable, resistance was futile, and his warriors were untouchable, but the political currents ran deeper. When tensions flared between England and France, tournaments became proxy battles. Knights wore colors hinting at royal allegiances, and victories were spun as moral triumphs for entire nations. A single clash in the lists could shift perceptions of a kingdom's strength, making diplomacy as vital as combat. Nobles exploited these spectacles with equal cunning. The notorious feud between the Duke of Burgundy and the Dauphin of France played out not on battlefields but in tournament arenas. Each man backed champions like chess pieces, knowing a public defeat would humiliate their rival more effectively than any siege. Even marriages were negotiated through these events. When a knight sponsored by a wealthy lord won glory, it wasn't just his reputation that soared, his patron's standing rose too, often attracting lucrative marriage offers for their families. The arena became a marketplace of alliances where bloodlines and borders were bartered over the crash of steel. Yet for all their utility, tournaments carried a volatility that terrified rulers. The same crowds cheering for champions could turn into mobs if a local favorite was cheated. In 1285, a tournament near Coventry erupted into a massacre when disputes over rules led to drawn daggers and a stampede. Monarchs like Henry II of England responded with sweeping bans, fearing these gatherings could mask rebel musters or drain treasuries needed for real wars. The irony, many of these prohibitions were ignored, especially by knights who'd mortgaged their lands to compete. The lure of glory and gold proved stronger than any decree. What made tournaments impossible to suppress was their dual nature. For rulers, they were pressure valves, a way to channel noble aggression into controlled outlets, preventing private wars that could fracture kingdoms. For ambitious knights, they were social elevators where a well-timed victory could vault them into royal service. And for the people, they were living myths, a chance to witness chivalry's ideals, however staged, in a world often brutal and bleak. The tournament wasn't just politics or sport. It was the medieval world in microcosm, a fragile balance of violence and pageantry, where every splintered lance told a story far beyond the arena's dust. William Marshall's legend reads like a medieval fairy tale, except it's all true. Born the younger son of a minor noble with no inheritance, he clawed his way up through sheer tournament mastery. By his 20s, he was the undisputed champion of the circuit, a man so feared that opponents would reportedly flee the field rather than face him. But Marshall's genius wasn't just in his sword arm, it was in his showmanship. He understood that reputation was currency, and he spent it lavishly. Once, after being captured in a melee, he bargained his way free by promising to return with ransom money, then promptly entered another tournament the same day, won enough gold to pay his debt, and still turned a profit. Stories like these weren't just exploits, they were carefully crafted performances designed to cement his status as the ultimate self-made knight. Then there's Ulrich von Littenstein, the medieval equivalent of a superstar athlete crossed with a troubadour. This Austrian knight didn't just compete, he turned tournaments into performance art. His most infamous stunt, jousting in disguise as King Arthur, clad in full silver armor while servants scattered rose petals in his path. He claimed to have broken 300 lances in a single season, a number historians debate, but one that perfectly served his purpose, to blur the line between man and myth. Von Littenstein's real weapon wasn't his lance, it was his quill. He penned epic poems exaggerating his feats, ensuring his legend would outlive his actual victories. What separated these men from mere competitors was their grasp of narrative. In an age without newspapers or social media, reputation spread through song and story. Marshall knew that letting an opponent yield gracefully could earn him more allies than crushing them, while von Littenstein understood that a well-told tale of chivalric devotion, like jousting for a lady's glove, could overshadow a dozen losses. Their careers reveal a truth modern athletes would recognize. Greatness isn't just about skill, it's about controlling the story, yet behind the glittering legends lay gritty realities. Marshall's rise required brutal pragmatism. He once fought for pay in a French tournament while technically in English royal service, a move that could have branded him a traitor. Von Littenstein's poetic flourishes likely masked financial struggles. His family lands were mortgaged to fund his extravagant stunts. These weren't flawless heroes, they were men playing a dangerous game where one bad season could undo decades of fame. Their true legacy, proving that in the tournament world, victory wasn't just won with steel. It was forged in the space between what happened and what people believed could happen. Chivalry's gleaming ideals shimmered like polished armor in the medieval imagination, but for tournament knights, the code was more survival manual than sacred oath. At its core, chivalry demanded three impossible virtues: unwavering loyalty to one's lord, unshakable courage in battle, and unblemished courtesy to all, especially ladies. Yet scroll through actual tournament records, and you'll find champions who bent these rules like cheap sword blades. Take the case of a 14th century French knight who paid off judges to declare his losses as wins, or the German contingent notorious for ganging up on lone opponents in melees. The truth, chivalry worked best as propaganda, a way to justify the carnage of the arena while keeping knights from sliding into outright anarchy. The code's evolution reveals its pragmatic roots. Early tournaments had no rules beyond win or be ransomed, but as the church and nobility sought to tame these violent spectacles, chivalry became a leash. By the 1200s, knights swore oaths before competing, vowing not to maim opponents intentionally or attack unarmed men. Marshals patrolled the fields, enforcing penalties like confiscated armor for gouging eyes or striking a downed foe. But loopholes abounded. A knight could claim he didn't see an opponent yield or argue that a brutal strike was accidental. The smartest learned to weaponize the code itself, like those who deliberately fought defensively, goading hot-headed rivals into making reckless moves that would label them unchivalrous in the crowd's eyes. Courtly love added another layer of contradiction. Poets spun tales of knights dedicating victories to distant noblewomen, but the reality was often transactional. A lady's favor might come with strings-attached political support for her family, or a subtle dig at a rival faction. Some knights, like the infamous Jacques de Lalaing, turned this into high art. He once jousted with a lady's sleeve tied to his helmet, only for historians to later reveal she was his patron's niece, and the gesture secured him a lucrative land grant. The best performers understood that chivalry wasn't about truth, it was about the story, yet for all its hypocrisy, the code shaped tournaments in profound ways. It gave meaning to the violence, transforming butchery into something resembling sport. It forced knights to at least pretend to care about fairness, laying groundwork for modern athletic rules. And in rare moments, like when Edward the Black Prince famously served his captured French opponents at a feast instead of demanding ransoms, it produced flashes of genuine nobility. The tension between chivalry's myth and reality wasn't a flaw. It was the engine that kept the tournament world turning. For every knight who cheated, there was another striving, however imperfectly, to be the hero the songs promised he could be. Tournaments transformed entire towns into pulsating centers of medieval life, where the clang of swords was just the opening act. Imagine a count's castle surrounded by a makeshift city of silk pavilions, bustling markets, and roasting pits large enough to cook whole oxen. For nobles, these events were strategic displays of power. A lord could bankrupt himself hosting a single tournament, but the payoff was worth it. The right feast could secure alliances, intimidate rivals, or even lure a wealthy heiress's attention. Tables groaned under exotic delicacies, spiced wines from Cyprus, sugared almonds from Valencia, each dish a silent proclamation of the host's reach and resources. Even the seating arrangements were political theater. A merchant placed too close to the high table might spark outrage among lesser nobles, while a visiting knight given inferior wine could carry that insult back to his king. For commoners, tournaments were equal parts carnival and social safety valve. Peasants who'd never seen their lord except on tax collection day now watched him joust in gilded armor, close enough to smell the sweat beneath the perfume. Street vendors peddled everything from roasted chestnuts to cheap tin badges of popular knights, while acrobats and fire eaters turned the sidelines into a medieval fairground. But this access was carefully controlled. The lists themselves were barred to all but the elite, reinforcing the unspoken rule: you could admire the spectacle but never cross into its world. Artisans and merchants thrived in this temporary economy. Armorers set up forges near the grounds, hammering out last-minute repairs at inflated prices. Tailors stitched heraldic banners overnight, while scribes penned victory letters for illiterate knights to send home. The real winners were often the innkeepers. Records from 14th century London show hostelries doubling their rates during tournaments, with some knights paying a month's wages for a flea-ridden bed. Even the church got involved. Abbots sold relics as good luck charms, while pardoners offered indulgences to knights for the preservation of their souls in lawful combat. Yet the tournament's most enduring social legacy was its role as a storytelling engine. Minstrels didn't just sing of battles, they crafted narratives that reinforced the feudal order. A song about a humble knight winning a lady's favor with pure heart rather than wealth told peasants their betters deserved power, while tales of treacherous upstarts reminded nobles to stay in line. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes spun Arthurian romances during tournament interludes, blending real champions with mythic ideals. By the time the tents folded and the knights rode off, every attendee, from duke to ditch digger, left with a renewed sense of their place in the world. The tournament wasn't just entertainment. It was the medieval equivalent of a society's mirror, polished to reflect exactly what its rulers wanted seen. Beneath the pageantry of fluttering banners and roaring crowds, tournaments hid a dangerous truth: they were as deadly as they were dazzling. For every knight who rode away with glory, another left on a stretcher or worse, in a coffin. The risks weren't just from lances and swords. Horses panicked, trampling fallen riders. Armor designed to deflect blows could overheat in summer sun, boiling knights alive inside their steel shells. Even the most cautious competitors faced catastrophe. In 1294, a German count drowned in his own helmet when he was knocked into a shallow stream and couldn't lift his head. These weren't freak accidents, they were occupational hazards in a world where entertainment and brutality were inseparable. Cheating thrived in this gray zone between sport and war. Some knights filed down lance tips to make them sharper, despite blunting rules. Others bribed judges, like the notorious 14th century case where a French champion paid off officials to ignore his opponent's broken stirrup, leaving the man defenseless in the saddle. Sabotage was just as common. Grooms whispered stories of feed laced with laxatives to weaken rival horses, or armor straps secretly cut to loosen at the worst moment. The most brazen even hired thugs to waylay competitors on the road before events. Why such desperation? Because losing wasn't just defeat, it could mean financial ruin. A knight who forfeited his armor in ransom might never afford another set, ending his career overnight. The psychological toll ran just as deep. Chroniclers wrote of knights who became drunk on the lists, chasing the adrenaline high of victory until they gambled away ancestral lands or sold themselves into debt. One Burgundian lord mortgaged his castle to fund a tournament season, only to be captured and ransomed, leaving his family homeless. Others used the chaos to settle scores, like the infamous feud between two English knights that turned a 15th century melee into a bloodbath when their factions ignored referees and fought with live steel. Authorities tried to intervene, but tournament culture resisted reform. When Pope Innocent II banned the events for being murderous revels, knights simply rebranded them as arms exercises and carried on. What makes this darkness so revealing is how it mirrors the contradictions of knightly life. The same code that demanded honor also pushed men to extremes where a single moment of weakness or cunning could define a lifetime. Tournaments didn't just test skill, they exposed the fragile line between hero and outlaw, between chivalry's ideals and the raw hunger for survival. In the end, the arena was a mirror, reflecting not just the glitter of medieval dreams, but the shadows that made those dreams so dangerously alluring. Tournaments didn't just dominate medieval arenas, they conquered the imagination of an entire era. leaping from dusty battlefields into the pages of literature and the vibrant colors of illuminated manuscripts. Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, immortalized them in The Knight's Tale, where jousting becomes a metaphor for love's chaos knights charging not just for glory, but for the favor of a woman who barely knows they exist. The tale's fictional tournament, with its crashing lances and fickle fortunes, mirrored real-life dramas so closely that audiences couldn't tell where reality ended and fantasy began. But Chaucer wasn't alone. Across Europe, scribes and poets spun tournament stories into moral lessons. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the joust is reframed as a test of integrity, where the real battle isn't against an opponent, but against one's own temptations. Artists, too, couldn't resist the tournament's allure. Tapestries like the Devonshire hunting tapestries wove jousting scenes into sprawling narratives, their threads capturing not just the action, but the spectacle, the fluttering banners, the nobles leaning forward in anticipation, the way sunlight glinted off a victor's raised visor. Illuminated manuscripts went further, blending fact with outright fantasy. In one 15th century book of Hours, a knight jousts with a unicorn, his lance splintering against the mythical beast's horn. These weren't mere decorations, they were propaganda, reinforcing the idea that tournaments weren't just entertainment, but sacred rituals linking earthly glory to divine favor. What made these events so irresistible to storytellers? Part of it was sheer drama, the tension of a single charge deciding a man's fate, the way a tournament could compress years of rivalry into one explosive afternoon. But deeper down, they offered a canvas for exploring medieval anxieties. In Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, tournaments become arenas of moral crisis. Lancelot's greatest struggle isn't defeating opponents, it's wrestling with his forbidden love for Guinevere, a conflict played out in coded gestures during jousts. The tournament, with its strict rules and very public stakes, became the perfect stage for examining the gap between chivalric ideals and human weakness. Even today, that legacy endures. From Ivanhoe to A Knight's Tale, modern retellings cling to the same themes: honor under pressure, the spectacle of violence, the thrill of an underdog's triumph. The tournament persists because it's more than history, it's a mirror. For medieval audiences, it reflected their dreams of order in a chaotic world, where a man could rise by merit and valor. For us, it's a window into an era that shaped our myths of heroism, reminding us that the hunger for glory and the cost of chasing it hasn't changed in 800 years. By the 16th century, the thunder of tournament lances was fading across Europe, but not with a single dramatic collapse. Instead, the tradition eroded like a suit of armor left out in the rain piece by piece. The rise of gunpowder weapons struck the first blow. Why spend years training to wield a lance when a farmer with a week's practice could fire a musket ball through the finest breastplate? Battlefields now favored disciplined infantry squares over charging knights, and nobles who once poured fortunes into tournament gear redirected their gold toward modern arsenals. Even the iconic armor itself became obsolete, thinner, lighter, and eventually relegated to parade displays rather than combat. Yet technology wasn't the only force at work. The Renaissance brought a cultural shift that found tournaments crude compared to the new vogue for theater, music, and intellectual salons. Kings like Henry VIII of England, who had jousted vigorously in his youth, now preferred masquerade balls where courtiers recited Petrarchan sonnets rather than shattered lances. The medieval tournament's mix of brutality and pageantry seemed out of step with an age that worshipped classical harmony and refined artistry. When Catherine de' Medici imported Italian ballet to the French court, the message was clear: violence as entertainment was falling from fashion. Still, tournaments didn't vanish, they transformed. What had once been lethal combat became choreographed theater. Noble families staged carousels, elaborate horseback ballets where riders in fanciful costumes tossed gilded spears at targets instead of each other. Armor, now purely ceremonial, gleamed with etched scenes from mythology rather than battle scars. Even the old jousting lists found new life as backdrops for royal weddings or coronations, their violence softened into symbolic gestures. In England, Elizabeth I revived tournaments as political propaganda, staging events where knights bore shields painted with allegorical messages about her reign, turning the arena into a living billboard. The tournament's afterlife lingers in surprising places. Modern rodeos echo the melee's chaotic energy, while Olympic fencing owes its rules to Renaissance duelists who adapted tournament techniques. Pop culture keeps resurrecting the imagery, from Shakespearean stage directions to Hollywood's love for jousting scenes. But perhaps the most telling legacy is how the tournament spirit survives in sports today. The World Cup's opening ceremonies, with their national colors and dramatic entrances, or boxing's pre-fight hype, reenact the same blend of combat and spectacle that once drew thousands to muddy fields. The armor is gone, but the human hunger for glory wrapped in ritual and narrative remains unchanged. What truly killed the tournament wasn't guns or changing tastes, but the end of the world that created it. As nations centralized power, individual knights lost their role as feudal warlords. Standing armies replaced private retinues, and courts valued administrators over warriors. The tournament, born in an age when personal combat skill meant survival, had no place in this new order. Yet, like all great traditions, it refused to die quietly instead. It shed its blood-stained skin and slipped into memory as something softer, stranger, and more enduring than anyone could have predicted. The clash of steel rings out once more, not on some forgotten medieval field, but in crowded arenas where modern knights painstakingly recreated armor charge at each other before cheering audiences. From the royal armories' grand tournaments in England to Renaissance fairs across America, the spectacle of jousting has been resurrected with astonishing authenticity. These aren't cheap imitations. Blacksmiths study centuries-old techniques to forge armor that moves and sounds like the real thing, while riders train for years to master the precise angle of a lance strike. The horses, too, are no ordinary steeds. Breeds like Frisians and Percherons, descendants of medieval war horses, are chosen for their strength and temperament. When a modern jouster's lance shatters against an opponent's shield, the echo isn't just entertainment, it's a living bridge to the past. What fuels this devotion? For some, it's the sheer thrill of danger. Even with safety measures, jousting remains one of the world's most hazardous sports. A misplaced lance can still send splinters through visor gaps, and a fall from a galloping horse in full armor risks broken bones or worse. Yet participants willingly embrace these risks, driven by something deeper than adrenaline. Historians point to a growing disillusionment with our digital age, where screens mediate so much of life. Strapping on 50 pounds of steel and charging forward demands a physicality and presence that modern life often lacks. There's also the allure of craftsmanship in an era of mass production. Armorers like Jeff Wasson, whose work adorns museums and reenactors alike, spend months on a single suit, using tools and methods unchanged since the 1500s. Every hinge and rivet becomes a rebellion against disposability. Beyond the joust, entire communities have sprung up to recreate medieval life down to the smallest detail. At events like the Society for Creative Anachronisms Wars, thousands camp in period tents, hand-stitching their clothing and cooking over open fires. The line between hobby and obsession blurs when you meet lawyers who spend weekends perfecting 11th century blacksmithing techniques or nurses who recite Chaucer by heart. This isn't just play acting. It's a form of time travel, an attempt to inhabit mindsets as well as costumes. When a reenactor describes the exhaustion of wearing armor for 12 hours or the camaraderie of sharing a mead horn with fellow knights, they're not just describing a scene, they're reclaiming sensations history books can't convey. Yet these revivals also spark debate. Purists argue that no modern event can capture the desperation of tournaments where lives and fortunes hung in the balance. The stakes today are theatrical, not existential, but defenders counter that the essence remains the honor of keeping one's word, the discipline of mastering forgotten skills, the visceral connection to human stories that transcend time. Perhaps the most telling sign of their success, children who watch these events don't see dusty history, they see heroes. And in that moment, the tournament's magic, centuries old and counting, flares back to life. Dawn at a tournament camp wasn't greeted by birdsong. It was shattered by the clang of hammers on steel and the sharp scent of burning coals from the blacksmith's forge. Picture rows of brightly colored pavilions, their fabric walls fluttering in the breeze, each housing a knight and his retinue like a traveling feudal court. These weren't just tents, they were mobile command centers where fortunes were made and lost before the first lance even splintered. A knight's entire world had to collapse into this temporary village, his armor polished by squires, his horses groomed by stable hands, his meals prepared by cooks who could turn battlefield rations into something resembling a noble's feast. The camp was a hive of specialized labor, fletchers mending arrows, leather workers stitching saddles, even minstrels practicing ballads to sing of their patrons' victories. Survival here demanded more than combat skill. It required logistical genius. Consider the challenge of moving a knight's entourage, which could include up to 40 people and 24 horses, across rutted medieval roads. Carts groaned under the weight of armor chests, spare lances, and barrels of salted meat. The wealthiest traveled with portable chapels for morning prayers, while others made do with shared resources, forging alliances over campfires. Every item had to be accounted for. Lose a single piece of armor en route, and a knight might forfeit his chance to compete. Records from the 1400s show some knights hiring guards specifically to prevent rival factions from sabotaging their gear, a reminder that espionage thrived as vigorously in these camps as on any battlefield. Yet within this chaos, strict hierarchies held sway. A knight's pavilion stood at the center, often marked by his heraldic banner, with squires sleeping at the entrance like human shields. Further out, servants and craftsmen erected their own shelters, their proximity to the knight's tent signaling their status. The camp's layout mirrored feudal society in miniature. Everyone knew their place, but ambition simmered beneath the surface. Young squires might sneak off to spar with rivals, hoping to impress visiting nobles, while seasoned knights held late-night strategy sessions over wine, debating which opponents to challenge or avoid. Gossip spread faster than plague here. A whispered rumor about a champion's injured shoulder could alter the next day's betting odds. The rhythm of camp life followed the tournament's pulse. Mornings began with weapons drills, squires holding padded shields while knights practiced lance strikes, their muscles memorizing the exact angle needed to unhorse an opponent. Afternoons might bring tense negotiations as knights haggled over ransoms or traded favors for prime positioning in the lists. Evenings blurred into feasts where alliances were sealed with handshakes and stolen kisses, the air thick with roast meat and intrigue. Through it all, the camp's true heartbeat was its noise, the neighing of war horses, the curses of armorers filing dents from yesterday's blows, the laughter of men trying to forget how much they'd wagered on tomorrow. What's often overlooked is how these transient villages became melting pots of medieval Europe. A French knight might borrow a German smith's technique for tempering steel, while an English squire learned Italian recipes from a camp cook. Tournaments were the original networking events, where a low-born servant with sharp ears could overhear trade secrets or political plots. The camps also birthed innovations, like the traveling surgeons who developed early triage systems to handle everything from splinter wounds to heatstroke, their knowledge later saving lives on actual battlefields. For all their glamour, these camps were also places of raw vulnerability. A downpour could turn the grounds into a swamp, ruining precious grain stores. Thieves slithered through the shadows, drawn by the glitter of unattended armor. And always there was the specter of violence, not just in the arena, but in drunken brawls or long simmering grudges erupting after dark. The greatest knights understood that surviving the camp was as vital as winning the tournament. They cultivated reputations for fairness to attract the best squires, generosity to ensure loyal servants, and enough calculated ruthlessness to keep rivals at bay. In the end, these makeshift cities reveal a truth no chronicle can capture, that behind every legendary joust stood an army of unsung heroes, the grooms who calmed skittish destriers, the laundresses scrubbing blood from tunics, the squires who held their breath as they tightened their lords' gauntlets before a charge. The tournament wasn't just won on horseback, it was won in the mud and smoke of the camp, where 1,000 unseen decisions shaped who would ride into glory and who would limp home forgotten. Squires didn't just carry a knight's armor, they carried his dreams. These young men, often no older than 14 when they began their apprenticeships, lived in a world of blistered hands and sleepless nights, where every chore was a test. A single smudge left on a breastplate could earn them a cuff to the ear, while a perfectly polished shield might catch their lord's eye and inch them closer to knighthood. Their days started before dawn, mucking out stables and hauling water, but the real work came in the training yards. There, they drilled with wooden swords until their arms trembled, learning to read an opponent's stance like a language. The best squires developed an almost supernatural awareness, anticipating when their knight would need a fresh lance mid-charge, or sensing the exact moment to tighten a loose strap before it became a fatal distraction. Grooms held lives in their hands literally. A knight's warhorse was worth more than a village, and its care was a sacred trust. These unsung experts memorized every twitch and snort of their chargers, mixing secret poultices for sore muscles or singing low, steady songs to calm nerves before the roar of the crowd. They knew which stallions turned skittish at the smell of blood and which mares would charge through hellfire if their rider asked, a groom's greatest pride. When a horse responded to their whispered command over the knight's proof, they'd forged a bond deeper than steel. Then there were the armorers, the alchemists of the tournament world. Their workshops rang with the music of hammers shaping destiny. A poorly riveted gorget could mean a lance tip found the throat. A misaligned quiz might lock a knee at the worst moment. The masters of this craft didn't just repair dents, they engineered survival. Some filed down the inside of pauldrons to grant extra mobility, while others lined helmets with lamb's wool to mace the deafening clang of a hit. Their most ingenious trick, crafting secret armor, pieces subtly thickened at common strike points but lightened elsewhere, giving their knight an edge invisible to rivals. The true measure of these teams wasn't just in victories, but in disasters averted. Chronicles tell of a squire who yanked his knight from the saddle an instant before a collapsing quintain would have crushed him, or an armorer who spotted a hairline crack in a visor no one else noticed. These weren't just close calls, they were testaments to the unbreakable chain of trust between a knight and those who made his glory possible. Lose that trust, and the next tournament might be your last. Yet for all their skill, support staff lived in the shadows. Squires who failed to earn their spurs often vanished from records, while grooms and armorers rarely saw their names carved in stone. But dig deeper and you'll find their legacy in the margins, a faded ledger noting payment to the smith who saved the duke's life, or a ballad mentioning a knight's faithful squire without naming him. Their reward, the rare, fleeting moment when their knight turned from the cheering crowd to nod at the figures in the dust below, the ones who'd turned preparation into perfection, one silent sacrifice at a time. A knight's coat of arms was more than paint on a shield. It was a living billboard shouting his story to the world. Every color, beast, and line carried coded meaning. A golden lion might declare royal favor, while interlocked rings hinted at a strategic marriage. These designs weren't just inherited, they evolved with each tournament victory. A knight who triumphed in a royal joust might add a crown to his crest, turning his shield into a resume of conquests. The heralds who interpreted these symbols weren't mere announcers. They were medieval fact-checkers trained to spot fraudulent claims. Woe betide the upstart who dared fake noble bearings. In 1423, a German knight was stripped of his armor for displaying a phony eagle emblem, his humiliation echoing across Europe. The tournament arena transformed heraldry into high-stakes theater. As knights paraded before the crowds, heralds boomed out their pedigrees like living history books. A well-connected herald could spin a minor lord's achievements into epic tales, while ignoring a rival's accomplishments could spark feuds. Some knights paid heralds in silver to emphasize certain deeds, a practice so common that King Edward III of England banned heralds from accepting bribes under penalty of losing their tongues. The most cunning competitors weaponized their symbols. When the Black Prince entered tournaments with ostrich feathers on his crest, a nod to his Bohemian mother's heritage, he wasn't just accessorizing. He was reminding everyone of his royal bloodlines while his French rivals fumed. Mistakes in this visual language carried real consequences. In 1189, two knights nearly sparked a war when their nearly identical arms caused confusion during a melee. One man's allies attacked him, thinking he was the enemy. After that, heralds began compiling rolls of arms, the medieval equivalent of trademark registries. By the 1300s, these records became so detailed they noted whether a lion should be depicted rampant or passant guardant, distinctions that could settle inheritance disputes. The system grew so sophisticated that modern corporate logos owe it a debt. Those golden arches and swooshes are distant cousins to the rampant lions and fleurs de lis of old. What made heraldry indispensable was its universality. In an age when most couldn't read, a shield's imagery crossed language barriers. A French peasant might not understand German, but he'd recognize the red and white bars of a Habsburg knight and know to steer clear. Tournaments amplified this power, turning each joust into a clash of dynasties. When Henry VIII tilted against Francis I at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, their armor bore not just personal arms, but entire galleries of ancestral symbols, a silent declaration that they weren't just men, but the living embodiments of centuries of power. The true masters of this art used heraldry to play psychological games. Some switched crests mid-tournament to confuse opponents, like the Duke of Burgundy, who secretly entered lists under a borrowed emblem to test his skills incognito. Others adopted ominous symbols, a black raven, a bloodied sword, to unnerve rivals before combat. But the most brilliant maneuver belonged to an Italian knight who, after losing his lands in war, competed with a blank silver shield. When asked why, he replied, "My deeds will write my arms anew." He won 6 tournaments in a row, and by the 7th, his once empty shield bore a golden phoenix rising from ashes, proof that in the tournament world, identity wasn't just inherited. It could be forged in the fire of the arena. The shift from brutal free-for-alls to regulated spectacles didn't happen overnight. It was a grudging dance between necessity and tradition. Early tournaments had all the structure of a tavern brawl, with knights clashing in sprawling melees where the only rule was survival. But as the bodies piled up both figuratively and literally, nobles realized unchecked violence was bad for business. The first major innovation, the lists, roped off boundaries that corralled the chaos into something resembling order. By the 1200s, marshals patrolled these arenas, armed with whistles to halt fights when armor buckled or swords struck forbidden zones like the back of the knees. Penalties ranged from fines to public shaming, like forcing a rule breaker to ride through town wearing a saddle backward. Scoring systems turned jousting from raw combat into a sport. Judges awarded points not just for unhorsing an opponent, but for stylistic flourishes. A lance shattered cleanly at the tip earned more glory than one that splintered near the grip. In Germany, the Rennen style rewarded daring riders who aimed for the helmet crest, while the safer Stecken favored shield strikes. These weren't arbitrary choices, they reflected regional pride. French tournaments emphasized grace, deducting points for clumsy recoveries, while Italian events prized aggression, letting knights score extra for driving rivals into the barrier. The tilt barrier revolutionized jousting more than any weapon or armor. What began as a simple rope to keep horses from colliding evolved into a wooden partition that protected riders and standardized distances. Purists howled that it stripped away the skill of horsemanship, but the numbers didn't lie. Fatalities plummeted. Suddenly, knights could train for precision rather than survival, leading to the golden age of technical jousting in the 1500s. Other innovations were more controversial. The lance arrestor, a hook that caught splintered wood before it impaled a rider, was banned in some regions for coddling the weak. Even blunted weapons sparked debate. Traditionalists claimed they encouraged reckless strikes since the risk of killing was lower. Behind every rule change lay a power struggle. When the church demanded lances be blessed to prevent unchristian aggression, knights simply had their weapons dipped in holy water, then sharpened the tips the moment clerics looked away. Kings exploited regulations too. Henry VIII famously rewrote tournament rules to favor taller riders after his growth spurt, ensuring he'd dominate the lists. The most enduring legacy of these reforms wasn't the rules themselves, but the shift they represented from chaos as entertainment to spectacle as art. What began as training for war had become a theater of controlled violence, where the greatest skill wasn't just breaking lances, but bending rules without getting caught. The church's stance on tournaments swung like a pendulum between fiery condemnation and strategic embrace. In the year 1130, Pope Innocent II issued a sweeping ban, declaring these events detestable markets of blood and vanity, where men risked their souls for fleeting glory. Clergy warned that knights killed in tournaments would be denied Christian burial, a terrifying prospect in an age where salvation hinged on proper rites. Yet for all this thunder, the prohibitions often rang hollow. Knights simply had their lances blessed by sympathetic local priests or donated a portion of their winnings to monasteries, buying spiritual insurance against the Vatican's wrath. What turned the tide wasn't morality, but manpower. By the 1200s, as crusades drained Europe of warriors, the church realized tournaments were talent pools for holy wars. Suddenly, the same events once damned as sinful became recruitment grounds. Bishops presided over crusader tournaments, where knights took vows on relic-strewn altars before competing. The ultimate bait, victory here could mean divine favor on distant battlefields. A Flemish chronicle tells of one knight who, after winning a Jerusalem-themed tournament, led 30 converts to the Holy Land, proof that spectacle could serve salvation. The arena itself became sacred ground. Before major jousts, knights processed to chapels where their armor was sprinkled with holy water, transforming steel into spiritual armor. Some even sewed relics into their gambesons, believing saintly bones could deflect lance strikes. The most devout competitions, like the Order of the Passions tournaments, blurred lines between sport and sacrament. Participants fasted beforehand, confessed sins publicly, and jousted in silence as monks chanted psalms. To modern eyes, mixing prayer with violence seems contradictory, but medieval spirituality held no such divides. A well-aimed lance thrust could be an act of devotion if the heart was pure. Yet hypocrisy lurked beneath the pageantry. The same church that praised tournaments for funding crusades turned a blind eye to their darker corners. Gambling tents thrived just beyond the chapel's shadow, while prostitutes plied their trade under the guise of comforting weary warriors. Even the clergy weren't immune to corruption. One 14th century bishop was defrocked for fixing tournament outcomes to pay his gambling debts. The truth, the church didn't so much sanctify tournaments as strike an uneasy truce with them, recognizing that trying to suppress these gatherings was like holding back the tide. For knights, faith wasn't a barrier to combat, it was the lens through which they justified it. Many saw jousting as a form of divine trial, where God's will manifested in the splintering of lances. The pious Sir Geoffroy de Charny, who literally wrote the book on chivalry, argued that tournament wounds were emblems of Christ's suffering, transforming pain into penance. Others embraced the paradox of holy violence, citing biblical warriors like David as proof that skill at arms could coexist with devotion. Their armor often bore engravings of the Virgin Mary alongside grisly battle scenes, a visual prayer for protection and prowess. This tension between salvation and spectacle reveals a deeper medieval truth. Spirituality wasn't separate from daily life, but woven into its very fabric. The tournament wasn't an escape from faith. It was faith in action, a place where a knight could confess his sins at dawn, shatter a rival's ribs by noon, and end the day donating his winnings to build a chapel. In the end, the church's dance with tournaments wasn't about hypocrisy, it was about meeting people where they were. If men insisted on fighting for glory, better to steer that passion toward crusades than ban it entirely. The arena became a pulpit, the lance a parable, and every clash a sermon written in steel and sweat. Germany's tournament fields ran red more often than most. Their Hofturnier events were less about chivalric grace and more about proving raw endurance. Picture armored knights battling not just on horseback but in grueling foot combats with poleaxes, where the goal wasn't just victory but survival. The Eisenach Codex, a 14th century rulebook, detailed contests where fighters could strike any part of the body except the back of the knees, and losers often left the field with concussions or shattered fingers. This wasn't mere brutality, it reflected a culture that prized martial pragmatism. German knights trained for the realities of fractured imperial politics, where feuds between rival lords could ignite without warning. A tournament here wasn't just sport, it was a rehearsal for the relentless skirmishes that defined the Holy Roman Empire. Italy, by contrast, turned tournaments into high art. Venetian and Florentine events resembled theatrical productions, with jousters dressed as characters from classical myths or biblical tales. The Giostra Alenolo, or ring joust, replaced violent clashes with precision drills, knights galloping to spear hanging rings with lances, their skill measured in millimeters rather than shattered shields. The difference wasn't just stylistic, it was philosophical. Italian city-states valued mercantile diplomacy over feudal warfare, and their tournaments mirrored this. A Sienese banker sponsoring a joust didn't want bloodshed. He wanted a spectacle that showcased his wealth and refinement, where the real competition happened in the lavish banquets afterward, amid whispered trade deals and marriage negotiations. France struck a balance between these extremes. The pas d'armes, or passage of arms, transformed jousts into narrative experiences. Knights would defend symbolic bridges or gates, challenging all comers in multi-day events blending combat with poetry recitals. Here, the line between fighter and performer blurred completely. A Burgundian knight might spend months crafting an elaborate backstory for his character, complete with allegorical armor engravings. This theatricality served a purpose, reinforcing the French crown's vision of knighthood as a unifying national ideal, far removed from Germany's fractured warlords or Italy's merchant princes. Even the horses revealed regional divides. German breeders favored massive destriers built to withstand brutal impacts, while Italian stables produced agile coursers capable of the intricate maneuvers required for ring jousts. French steeds, much like their riders, were trained for flair, their prancing steps and arched necks designed to dazzle spectators. These weren't just animals, they were cultural statements on four legs. The true outlier was Spain, where Moorish influences created a unique hybrid. Jugos de Cogna's tournaments saw Christian knights adopting Muslim-style horsemanship, their colorful silk turbans and light javelins a far cry from Northern Europe's hammering lances. Here, the arena became a rare space where religious rivalries paused and borrowed traditions flourished. What united these variations was their shared language of symbolism. Whether in a German melee's bone-crunching pragmatism or an Italian giostra's poetic precision, every tournament whispered the same truth. How a society fights its mock battles reveals how it views power, honor, and itself. The armor might gleam differently from region to region, but the human hunger to prove worth under pressure that transcended borders. The armored shadows of tournament nights stretch far beyond their medieval arenas, shaping ideals that still echo in surprising corners of modern life. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst trace their honor codes directly to chivalric principles where a warrior's word once bound him as tightly as any oath. The modern concept of officer and gentleman carries whispers of those old tournament fields where skill with a sword was meant to serve higher virtues. Even the handshake, a global gesture of trust, finds roots in knights removing their right gauntlets to prove they came unarmed. The tournament's greatest export wasn't combat techniques, but the radical idea that strength required moral scaffolding. Literature would be unrecognizable without these knights. Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur and Création de Troyes romances transformed real tournament champions into mythic archetypes, templates for everything from Tolkien's Gondorian knights to Star Wars Jedi. George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones jousts owe their political tension to actual medieval events where outcomes swayed royal marriages. The tournament's DNA persists because it distilled human drama into its purest form. Individual glory clashing with duty, love entangled with ambition, and the eternal question of whether ideals can survive real-world tests. Modern sports unconsciously mirror the tournament spectacle. The Super Bowl's halftime shows and WWE's theatrical entrances descend from knights parading with painted shields. Olympic fencing's scoring system evolved from jousting point rules, while hockey's enforcer role mirrors the tournament's designated champions who settled group grudges in single combat. Even as sports tournaments, with their sponsored athletes and roaring crowds, recreate the same alchemy of skill and showmanship that once drew thousands to muddy fields. Yet the most enduring lesson lies in the tournament's contradictions. These knights were both warriors and performers, mercenaries and idealists, living proof that human beings contain multitudes. Their legacy reminds us that every era gets the heroes it deserves. In our age of viral moments and personal branding, perhaps we haven't outgrown the tournament's core truth that how we compete reveals who we truly are. The armor changes, but the hunger to prove oneself before the eyes of the world, that remains timeless. The world of tournament nights was a dazzling mix of violence, pageantry, and ambition, a stage where steel and spectacle collided to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. These men weren't just fighters, they were the ultimate multitaskers of the medieval world, juggling the demands of combat, commerce, and courtly politics with the precision of a tightrope walker. Consider the sheer range of skills required. A champion might spend his morning negotiating ransom terms with a defeated rival, his afternoon rehearsing poetic vows for a lady's favor, and his evening calculating how much his latest victory could inflate his sponsorship value. This wasn't just a career, it was a high-wire act where one misstep could mean financial ruin or social exile. What made their world so fascinating was its contradictions. The same tournaments that preached chivalric ideals also rewarded cunning and opportunism. Knights like William Marshall mastered the art of the gracious victory, publicly praising fallen opponents while quietly pocketing their ransoms. The code of honor they celebrated was often a carefully crafted illusion, as malleable as the armor they wore. Yet this duality wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival. In an era where reputation meant everything, tournament knights became early masters of personal branding, their coats of arms functioning like medieval logos and their victories carefully curated for maximum impact. Their legacy lives on in ways they could never have imagined. Modern sports stars echo their strategies, from leveraging fame for endorsements to cultivating rivalries that boost ticket sales. The concept of athletic competitions as geopolitical soft power, tournament nights were their first, their jousts serving as proxy battles between nations. Even reality TV's obsession with drama and redemption arcs finds its roots in the medieval lists, where every competitor had a backstory designed to win crowd favor. As we revisit their stories, we're not just looking at history, we're holding up a mirror to our own obsessions with fame, competition, and self-invention. These nights remind us that human nature hasn't changed, only the arenas have. Their tournaments were the social media of their day, a space where personas were performed, alliances forged, and legends built one viral moment at a time. The next time you see a stadium roar to life or a viral challenge sweep the internet, remember, the tournament knights wrote the playbook centuries ago. If this glimpse into their world has sparked your curiosity, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below. Are there other historical figures who have shaped modern culture in surprising ways? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners. Until next time, keep looking beyond the surface because the past never really leaves us. It just waits for the right moment to whisper its secrets.